Hello, and welcome to the hashtag Here to Hear Keeping It 100 podcast. My name is Damon Naylor, and I'll be serving as your host. I am the Membership Enhancement Facilitator for NAFCM, and I'm joined by my co-host, DG Mon, the president of NAFCM. Hello, DG. What's going on, man?
Good morning, Damon. Just sitting here sipping my coffee and can't wait to get started. I hear you got a great guest this morning.
Yes. We have somebody in the waiting room waiting on us, and that special guest is Julie Rouge out of Arlington, Virginia. Julie is the Associate Dean and Associate Professor at the Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution at George Mason University. So we're just excited, DG, to have her. And at this time, we're going to go ahead and bring her in.
Ah, there she is. Though she wasn't in the house.
I know, right?
I know.
Disappeared on
us. Did Dr. Rouge leave us? Did we scare her away? What's going on? Come on, we'll be nice. Oh, there she is. All right.
Hello, Julie. How are you?
Good morning. How are you?
Doing excellently. We just told everybody about our great special guest, and we just want to allow you to share anything with the audience that you would want them to know outside of the formal stuff.
That's a great question. So maybe to say that I've had the pleasure for the last several years of working with a lot of NAFCM and different NAFCM centers around the country on different projects, including working on the State of Community Mediation Survey, which we did a few years ago. So it's been a real pleasure for me to get to know the organization better and get to know a lot of the great work that is happening in communities around the country. So my formal role, is with George Mason, but I get to do a lot in partnership with a lot of different community organizations. And that's where I think the impact really is.
Wonderful. Thanks for sharing that with the audience. So we're so glad to have you as our guest today, and we're going to just dive into this leading community conversations for community social justice reform.
Yeah.
And just right off the bat, what difficult issues connected to historical legacies are communities grappling with today? What are they struggling with? What's going on?
Yeah, I think I'm going to focus mainly on what's happening in the U.S. and predominantly kind of in the D.C. area, but maybe just to preface to say that this isn't unique to us, right? We have all over the world and in communities in many different countries and in all regions, people are trying to figure out how to live with the historical legacies, particularly legacies of conflict and violence that have impacted their communities. So, there's great research and writing by political psychologists and social psychologists about how this impacts communities. But I'll kind of focus in on the DMV district, Virginia, Maryland area, and some of what we've been dealing with here. For people that don't know, the DC area was kind of the primary space where much of the Civil War was contested, just physically. The majority of battles happened within a few miles of DC, plus or minus. And so it's an area that is rife both with the actual historical artifacts, right, of the Civil War and pre-Civil War and post-Civil War, but also a lot of the holder of the legacy, right? Richmond, Virginia was the capital of the Confederacy. So this area, which is 90 miles up the road from Washington, D.C., which was the capital of the Union. So the contesting around the Civil War and the ideas within the Civil War around freedom and the right to own people and have an economic system that is structured around owning people, the physical structures are all really vibrant here. And our physical spaces are many reminders built in to that. And so, I think for us, we're thinking about a couple different things. One is what to do with the actual historical places. How do we understand the homes of George Mason, for instance, my university, and George Washington, recognizing that these are homes of people that owned people, and that the reason they were able to be important men and founders was because they had the time to think and do the kind of philosophizing because other people were running the economic system that they benefited from, right? So there's really interesting conversation. How do we remember the values and the things that were brought forward by people in our history that are important figures without flattening them and only remembering that? How do we honor and acknowledge the contributions of the much broader group of people that supported and allowed them to do that work? And we've been doing some of that, here at George Mason University in terms of doing some both visual and archaeological remembrance of the slaves of George Mason and recognizing some of their contributions and bringing them forward. So I think that's one area, but then there's a whole set of other areas that have to do with, you know, the changes that were made in our physical landscapes in the aftermath of the Civil War as white Southerners, frankly, grappled with what to do and how to understand the Civil War they had just fought and try to frame it in a way that it was maybe more socially acceptable, that allowed them to keep a heroic patina on it. And the real emphasis, and if folks haven't looked into it, I'd really look into the Lost Cause legacy and some of the different ways that was formed and intentionally created as a way for Southerners to maintain a more positive sense of identity in the wake of the Civil War. But that's led to a bunch of different things in this area. So we have street names that are named after Confederate generals everywhere. The main street up until 2 years ago that ran kind of from DC out to West Virginia was called Lee Highway, and Lee Jackson Memorial Highway. And there's all derivatives of Lee and different variations of that everywhere here. You can't turn 3 corners without coming across a street name. But we also have lots of different physical monuments and markers outside of the historical places. So whether it's in cemeteries where you'll have Confederate burial grounds that have markers put up by the Daughters of the Confederacy, or historic homes that have markers that, depending on who wrote the historic marker, may sound like it's quite sympathetic to the Confederate cause, right? And then we also have a lot of different kinds of symbols. So one community I worked in still had a Confederate soldier who was the first soldier to die during the Civil War, but this Confederate soldier was a symbol on the patch of their city seal. And so it was on every police officer, every firefighter, every county vehicle had this Confederate soldier on it. So, you know, it's not as, I think sometimes people think it's a really simple thing just to say we need to take the things down, or we need to remove the seals, or we need to not have these monuments. But I think what that leaves us with is not having had the conversation about what the history means to us. What are we learning from it? How do we interact with each other differently? What are the values that we want to carry into our current communities? And so I think often people get really focused on is it up or is it down? Do we, you know, does it, and we had cases in Baltimore nearby, for instance, where, you know, a few years ago, people were taking down statues in the middle of the night, which I think for a certain element of the population felt really satisfying, right? That you got this statue down, but it didn't do anything to actually help the communities have conversations about what does it mean? How are those legacies still showing up in our contemporary conflicts and the contemporary structures that we have in our communities?
Yeah, so I can only imagine. Thank you for the historical information and kind of bringing a balance, helping us to see it. But I can only imagine that you guys in that location, that area, how you're in the midst of it. So like you're saying, you're in the thick of it. You're trying to be the mediator and trying to paint both sides, you know, giving both sides their, I guess, understanding and their information, and sharing the historical aspects of each side. But, you know, I can only imagine that it's sometimes tumultuous, and sometimes, you know, a conflict with it, especially with those who are the descendants of slaves, you know, the African Americans and those individuals. So, but yes, so did you want to step in and say anything on that?
When you're having those conversations, you said it's about value. So in my mind, did everyone then conclude to leave the soldier on their patch? Because he clearly was there to represent the value of protecting community. And I will sacrifice my life to protect the community. I can't imagine the community, no matter what position you have, not holding that as universal value. Or were there members who said, no, that's not a value for us?
Yeah, you know, I think what there was a variety of different issues this particular community had on their plate, and one included the cemetery and the Confederate plot in the cemetery, and a memorial that was erected in like the 1920s by the Daughters of the Confederacy to honor the citizens of that community who had died as part of Confederate soldiers. And one of the things the group came out very strongly with, so this is a group of stakeholders, it was 16 people who were chosen from across the community to try to gather, and from very different perspectives when they started on what should happen, but to try to gather information and represent the community in thoughtful decision making, along with some broader community process. But one of the things that they said very strongly is that one of the principles they wanted to live by was the dignity of human life. And for them, that meant that things that were in the cemetery that were actual markers of individual people and their contributions and their memorials were things that they ended up choosing to leave in place. They wanted to add some additional, what's the word? Just historical information about where some of these different markers came from. But they very much said that they really thought that this value of around the dignity of human life, no matter who that human life was very important. And so not changing things that were erected to acknowledge individual people. I think what was interesting about the city seal was that the city was incorporated in the 1960s, and that Confederate soldier didn't appear on that seal until the early 1980s. So to some respect, it was probably political when it appeared, right, in terms of a particular statement that was being made. And it also wasn't something that resonated. And so, I thought the most interesting comments that came out of that process was, as we got to the end, one of the folks who had started out being very much interested in preserving history and very much wanted to make sure that we didn't do something that was going to erase the history of the community and the important part this community had carried. He kind of turned to the group and he said, I don't, these things don't bother me, right? Having the Confederate soldier on the seal or the street names, they don't bother me, but I've heard my community members and my friends say that this is hard for them. And that, jogging down the street on the cross country team and turning on Plantation Parkway onto Confederate Lane is something that members of my community find deeply uncomfortable. So he's like, even if it doesn't bother me, I don't want members of my community to feel uncomfortable. And that's the biggest value, right? Was having a community that was inclusive. So I think we were trying to navigate the conversation with them, which was, how do you build an inclusive community that feels welcome to everyone? And recognize that we might have different interpretations of what these symbols mean and what the baggage is they carry, and that they create harm for some folks, and for other folks, they're just part of the wallpaper and not even visible and don't have much affect at all. So, TG, it's an interesting question because it's not always clear cut what the value is that wants to win out. But I think for communities to think about what's the underlying value of the community they want to hold, and then how do these symbols and structures and institutions represent or not represent those values. But I don't think you get there just by tearing the thing down, right? You have to have the conversation about why bringing it down represents the value of the community.
If I can just, then my follow-up is, how do you have people come to that realization this gentleman did that you talked about? When so many times when I hear people say what you say, I hear you trying to erase people that are in my family, that are part of what it meant here in Kentucky.
Yeah.
So how do you talk about that?
Yeah, I think that there's kind of a couple different areas that we can think about, and one is what are and we have sections of battlefields here. We have all sorts of different kind of museums and places that we are formally memorializing and teaching about that kind of history. And so thinking about what is the appropriate place for historical remembrance in our everyday day-to-day, and do we create, and I think we have here in Northern Virginia, robust spaces where that history is being worked with all the time and reinterpreted and relearned. And as we get more information, as I said, we've been working, there's been multiple reinterpretations at George Mason and George Washington's homes, where they're changing the museum structures there, right, as they're trying to learn and grow about who's being represented there. So I do think that there is a space to say, at least here, and I can't speak for every context, that there is a robust historical remembrance component and organizations that are doing that work quite strongly. And so I think there's an argument to say you don't have to have it in your everyday symbols, or it doesn't have to be a component. But let me also slice it to say that, one of the things that we looked at 40-something street names. In this particular area, we've looked at over 150 different street names. And one of the things we looked for were for specificity. So some of these names that immediately get resonated with the Confederacy might have been family names that had been in this area for 300 years, right, prior to the Confederacy. And so there's been some attempts to try to make the distinction to say, were these names really put into place as memorialization of this specific person who is problematic, who's seen as problematic, or are these names more generally names of our broader community? And so there's been some choices to not remove some street names that have a broader community base, even though they can link to the Confederacy also. So and that's tricky stuff, right? To have the historians really getting into and getting, you know, what was the charter for this street name? What did the city council in the 1880s that adopted the name, or in the 1940s, what did they say they were trying to do when they adopted this name? Where did this come from? But I think that information gathering piece is really important, so that we're all, we know where things came from, and we know what the choices are we're making. You know, who are we choosing to not continue to honor in this way? And does that represent the values of the community